Well, good morning. We are having a bit of internet problems, so we're doing a recording that's going to get edited, so it's going to be an hour or two later. Apologies for that. And further apologies, last week we had a tornado wind come through the outdoor studio. It would just been impossible to get it done. And then
And then
one more further
what happened when
apology.
you tried to record it the next
The
day?
next day I sat down in my lounge and I took time to do it nicely. The best I've ever done
So articulate.
without the mic on. So it's been a bit of a
So what
struggle
happens
here.
when I'm not with you to see?
It's a type of technical issue that's got nothing to do with the technical side and all to do with the operator. Anyway, we're in Genesis through ancient eyes. And today we're going to have a look at Isaac. Isaac, of course, is the son of promise according to Abraham. So last time we spoke about Abraham and how Abraham is a mirror to some degree of an exit from the Babylonian way, exit out of polytheism, the Babylonian way to try and reach God, and also later in Abraham's life, of course, an exit from Egypt with a lot of loot. And so in that way, Abram kind of mirrors what happens to Israel. Israel also has to exit Egypt with a lot of loot, and later also has to depart from Babylonian ways and come out from Babylonia and come back into the promised land. Right, so this whole series is based on trying to have a look at Genesis from a more historic perspective. In other words, trying to understand better how the people who wrote it, why they would have written it in a particular way, and also how the people who would have had it read to them, how they might have perceived it. In other words, we're trying to get away from reading Genesis as a book written to all humanity and specifically to us, to understand it more for the purpose and the function that it was in fact written for. And one of the things we've picked up on is that although there are many little separate stories, they really tell one tale. Genesis is the genesis of the nation of Israel. How did Israel come about? Where do they come from? How they have come through all their struggles, their forefathers. And it has become quite evident, as we'll see again today, that this was written quite a long time after the fact or after the events that it's describing. Most scholars agree that the book of Genesis comes in its final form around the 6th century in the wake of the Babylonian exile. So that's a rather important point. And I think once you become aware of that, stories like the Tower of Babel and the Noah's flood and some of the stories we'll see again today kind of find their proper context, because this is a book that is written to an Israel that is in deep distress. They've just gone through their greatest national disaster by being expelled from their land in the same way that Adam and Eve was expelled from their land of promise. And now they stand at the crossroads of, do we go back? Historically, we know that a lot of the Israelites never went back. They actually stayed in Babylon. And in fact, a separate Jewish tradition developed in Babylon, and a separate set of scriptures, in fact, also developed in Babylon, the Babylonian Talmud. So today we're focusing on Isaac. Last week, as I said, we did Abraham. So Isaac comes. He, of course, is married to, I can't remember her name, it was Rebecca, of course. She gets fetched. But just before Abraham dies, it's this episode where there has to be a wife for Isaac. And Isaac can't just intermarry the people in Canaan or in this new land. He has to kind of go back and fetch someone from his heritage. And so this is the last thing that has to happen before Abraham dies, is Abraham has to find a wife for his son of promise. And does so then, and Rebecca then becomes that girl. Right, quickly after Rebecca comes and gets married to Isaac and they become a unit, Abraham, of course, then he dies off. Okay. After this, Genesis quickly pit stops with a ancient header. These are the descendants of, and this one is the 7th one, and it's dedicated to Ishmael. And this is quite strange for a lot of us. Like, why is there mention of Ishmael? You know, I don't want to say too much about it, but most people believe the Arab nations come from Ishmael, and There's issues between the two, as we very well see even till today. But the reality is that in the book of Genesis, Ishmael is blessed by God. God looks after him. He is promised sons and inheritance, and is actually, in a way, looked after to some degree. And one of these chapter headings, ancient chapter headings, is dedicated to him. Then we get to the eighth one of these ancient chapter headings, and this one, of course, is then dedicated to Isaac, right? And it's the genealogy of Isaac and so on. And this is in Genesis 25, verse 19. Okay, so something we want to have a look at, which is an interesting thing, is that Isaac channels Abraham, or as my kids today would say, Isaac is giving Abraham. Right, very interesting, and we'll see that in a moment. All right, so Isaac and the account of his sons is not so much about him, but it's actually about Jacob and Esau, these two twin brothers. One of them is really, really special to our story because Jacob is later renamed as Israel, the main character of the book of Genesis. And really the entire Torah is about God's relationship with Israel. And so here in this section, we find a Jacob turned into an Israel, right? The name change, and we'll speak about that in a moment. Most of the attention, of course, then goes to Jacob, and it leads us into the next chapter. Isaac is most known for his Mount Moriah episode. Besides that, he plays a supporting role, except for the portion in Genesis 26, when he and Rebekah travels to Gerar, and we'll say a little bit more about that. But Isaac is driven into a foreign land because of a famine. Now, this should remind you of someone. This is what happened to Abraham. Okay, famines might have been rough at that time, so nothing strange about that. But he meets a Philistine king called Abimelech, right? As he's driven into the Philistine land because of a famine in what would later be the Promised Land, right? He goes there to get some help, but strangely enough, he knows or believes that the Philistine king would kill him if he realized that his wife Rebekah is his wife. And so he lies about it. He says, she's my sister. And so spares his own life. Now, this becomes interesting because in the accounts of Abram, there's the exact same story. Abram goes to a king called Abimelech, and the exact same thing happens. So, what do we make of that? It's quite strange that we would tell the exact same story of two people, a father and his son. In fact, this type of thing happens twice to Abram. One of the times he goes to Egypt, and it happens to him. Most scholars that I have read seems to believe that this is actually a duplicate, and that it's the same story, but it was applied in some traditions to Abraham, and in some traditions it was applied to Isaac. Maybe I could say this at this point, that we know from the way that the Torah is put together, and specifically from the evidence of the duplets inside of the Torah, that there are multiple traditions represented within the Torah. Okay, so two of the major traditions represented in the Torah are traditions that come from the northern tribes of Israel and traditions that come from the southern tribes of Israel. And so when these books are written and put together, it seems like the writers, which obviously this happens after the 8th century, in which the northern tribes come down and join the southern tribes, which archaeology can almost clearly demonstrate. They actually bring literacy, as far as we can see. They bring technology with them. They seem to have been a much more advanced group of people. They unify with the southern group at the time that the Assyrians basically flatten the northern tribes. And so it seems like traditions from the south and traditions from the north are built in together in the Torah. So for instance, stories like most of the judges seems to come from the northern tribes. The ideas of David obviously come then from the southern tribes. And it seems like scholars have quite a good idea of what comes from where, because of what it's type of language it contains, the way people write about the temple or about religion within it, some trademarks that can be separated quite nicely. Point being of all of that is many of the scholars estimate that this story about Isaac going to the Philistine king Abimelech and then having to lie about his sister because he's worried about his life is actually the same story that was applied to Abraham, but possibly from a different tradition. All right, so let's leave that there. So we know that Abraham had a similar story, and he also went to Gerar, also King Abimelech, and the same thing happens there. And this is in chapter 12, and that's quite a long while back, right? So while in Gerar, God tells Isaac not to follow Abraham's steps and not to go to Egypt, but to stay put. So Gerar is within the borders of the future promised land. And so at this point, it seems like Isaac is busy staying within the boundaries. Even where Abraham went to Egypt for help, Isaac is kind of staying within the boundaries of the promised land. He is, after all, as the writers indicate, the son of promise. So he's more connected to the land, it seems, in that sense. So the promise doesn't end with Abraham, and that's probably the point of the story of Isaac, that this promise is transferred to a son, the son of promise, and then will then again be transferred to Jacob, who becomes this Israel. One of the more interesting things in this chapter is that we know that from archaeology and from the evidence we have from the Bronze Age collapse, that the Philistines weren't there in the time of Abraham or Isaac or Jacob. Right? The Philistines arrive, made a note here, but they come from the west, and they come at around, I think they were part of the Sea Peoples that come after the Bronze Age collapse. So as far as I remember, speaking slightly under correction, but Canaan, that land where the Philistines and even the Promised Land portions were actually under the control of Egypt until the Bronze Age collapse came. Scholars are still debating what brought about the Bronze Age collapse, but it was a collapse of civilization in and around 1200 BCE. And so it's only after this that the Philistines come as the Sea Peoples from the Grecian side, from the side of Greece, the western side, and they come and populate Canaan, or a place that we would now call Canaan. So, and it seems like the archaeology confirms that quite clearly. So the point we're trying to make, or that is made here in the book, is simply that it is obvious that the people who are writing this portion of Genesis and the people who wrote the portion in about Abraham going to Abimelech, the Philistine king, are writing from a much later time, where the Philistines had been there already. So let's assume, just for argument's sake, that the Philistines arrive in 1200 BCE. Right? Okay, that's still almost 800 to 1,000 years after Abraham. Right? So it seems to us that if the Genesis account was brought together in around the 6th century BCE, that for the writer of this portion, the Philistines had always been there. Yeah. And so he anachronistically projects that back into the time of Abraham, which is just another little piece of evidence that corroborates with so many other pieces, showing us that these stories did not have this form in the time that they are writing about, but that they were later shaped for the people that they were written to. Okay, so we've made that point a couple of times during this, but it's actually an incredibly important point as we've gone through this series, because it's important that we understand when Genesis was written and for who, because that brings context and understanding about what's actually going on in there. All right, so basically this once again shows us that the stories reflect in them a reality for a much later time. By the time these stories were written down in the form that we have them today, the Philistines had a long time been an enemy of Israel. They were the occupants of Canaan already for centuries. So the writer simply takes it for granted, or took it for granted, that they'd always lived there, which makes perfect sense for the writer that has no access to history. No internet, no newspaper clippings. They're there now, so we guess they've always been there. Everyone I talk to tells me they've always been there. So it's limited knowledge that's written down. And I think this is important to understand that what we're dealing with in the Torah is limited knowledge. I come from a tradition that does not believe that. We believe that whatever is written in the Torah, basically God grafted himself, and there can't be any mistakes, and it can't be limited at all, but it knows more than what we know. But the reality is that there's a lot, there's too much evidence that kind of just shows us that Genesis is written from the limited perspective of people. In our creation stories, our flood stories, our Babylonian tower stories, and the constant anachronisms that's being employed by the writers tell us that they are humans writing their experience of God and their journey.
Yeah.
So that's rather important. Another theory is to say, okay, maybe these writers knew that the Philistines weren't always there, but they were just trying to contemporize the story for their audience. And this is theoretically, this is possible. But the point is that either way, the stories were shaped for the benefit of the contemporary audience. And that we need to understand. They were not shaped for us.
Yeah.
They were shaped for that audience. So unless we understand that audience, what they've been through, what they were going through, we can't actually interpret Genesis. We can't take Genesis out of its context and interpret it for ourselves. We have to understand and take into account its ancient context. Okay. Let's take a quick, interesting detour here. As we know, the Hebrew Bible is largely from the time of the kings. That's the estimate is that the earliest writing down of pieces of the Torah comes probably from the 8th century, maybe a little bit earlier time of Solomon and so on, and then finally put together around the 6th century in the forms. We have to understand that we have the Bible in the Hebrew that didn't exist in the time of Abraham. There was no language like the Hebrew that the Bible is written in.
Yeah.
This is just another little thing that you need to think about. If Moses did write any of this, he would not have written it in a language that did not yet exist. Just another thing to tell us what era we're dealing with, right? We don't, and the point is that we don't have any evidence that gives us writings from an earlier time in an earlier language. We just don't have it. So to just postulate it without evidence is a little bit irresponsible. So the evidence points towards the time of the kings down to the 6th century exile. Thus again, it doesn't mean that the stories were made up in the 6th century. Someone sat down and said, I think we'll create a guy called Abraham. That's not what scholars believed. The central line scholars believe actually happened, but that these stories had some historical kernel, but the stories, as humans do, constantly shaped for each generation they came through, so that what we finally have is not a historical biography of anyone, but a theological story that is supposed to convey a lesson for an exiled Israel, if I can put it in that way. Okay, so from here, from Isaac, we move to Jacob and Esau. Now, if you've been in church like me all my life, the amount of stories about Jacob and Esau you would have told and you would have heard, they really are kind of endless. They're both born from Rebekah. They're twins, but Esau is the oldest. Now, in biblical times, in the patriarchal society, the oldest son is the firstborn. The oldest son gets a double inheritance. He's just, God chooses him, and sorry for everybody else. But Jacob and Rebekah, they think up a scheme to steal the birthright from the one that kind of God, by his order, ordained. That's kind of weird a little bit. Jacob buys it for a bowl of soup from Esau. Nobody knows what Esau was thinking. But the weird part is his mother, Rebecca, helps him then to deceive Jacob, and he gets the blessing. That can't be reversed. I mean, you would think that Jacob can say, my apologies to everyone. This is the wrong guy, a deceiver. He deceived me, so sorry, you don't get the blessing. Go sit in the corner. Esau, come, let's do this properly. But according to the story, it can't be reversed now, and the deceiver becomes the one who has this special blessing. Now, that makes perfect sense when we realize this is written from hundreds of years later, where the deceiver becomes the one who inherits Israel, Jerusalem, the temple, and is now the center of the entire story. So we have this sibling rivalry that is something we see often of in the Bible. It's something we see often in real life, not something very strange to real life. But in the Bible, we see often sibling rivalry. It starts as early as Cain and Abel. It moves, and there's many examples. I've got them here, so let me quickly run through them. I'll run through them in this format. The strange part is this, that God often prefers the younger brother, although he's the one institutes the firstborn right. So it's a little bit weird, but God prefers Seth, who is the younger brother of Cain. He becomes the line through which the Savior eventually is born. And so many examples, let me give you some of them. God leapfrogs the older. Seth takes the honor and the place of first importance over Cain. Isaac is chosen over Ishmael. He becomes the son of promise. Joseph is chosen over all his older brothers. Yeah, as I go through these, you'll realize. Many people don't know, but Aaron was actually older than Moses, but Moses becomes the lead priest, if you want to call it that. David is chosen. I've already said that. Solomon is chosen over his older brother Adonijah, and also here in this case, Jacob, the younger deceiving brother, is chosen over his older brother Esau. So Jacob, although born second, he grabs the heel of Esau as they come out, and I've told the story about. I don't want to go too much into how they did this deceiving little trick, but the writer of this book says, let's not make excuses for Rebecca and Jacob. They were cheats. There's no point in making excuses for them. They did a terrible thing. Yeah. So the interesting thing about the story of Jacob and Esau is that Esau becomes Edom and Jacob becomes Israel. Now, Edom is the southeastern bordering nation to Israel that at the later stage would become, there's always a struggle between these two nations. So the writers are writing it back into a story to explain
How they got there.
why Israel is in conflict with Edom always. And then even there's a blessing that goes out over Jacob and Esau, and it says that Esau is going to basically come under the yoke of Jacob. Jacob's going to kind of subjugate him, and then he will break loose at a later time. And guess what? That's exactly what happens in the story of Israel and Edom. Now, in the past, I would always read those blessings in Genesis and say, "Oh, look at this prophetic writing about what was to come." But I now realize that that's not what's going on. It's the other way around. These letters, these books, these stories are written after Edom had already been subjugated and broke away. And so these writers are constantly writing back into their history. Same, we had the case a little bit earlier in some of our sessions where Ham and Canaan they were done in the same way. A contemporary enemy of Israel is written as someone cursed from the beginning by Noah. And so it happens quite often. So not necessarily a prophetic writing about a prediction about what the future looked like, but an interpretation of the present written into the past. So that's quite sobering, really. to think about it in that way. Jacob deceives his father and his brother, and he runs, right? Esau wants to kill him. Esau then goes out of, it seems like, spite, and goes and marries a Canaanite woman, the worst thing an Israelite can ever do. And Jacob runs off to his uncle Laban. And here's the age-old story that, of course, Jacob, then on his way there, he gets to a place called Bethel. And this is where God reiterates the promise that God gave to Abraham of land and people and descendants, stars, and like the stars, like the sand. This is reiterated to Jacob at Bethel, the house of God, to show that this Israel, this Jacob, this deceiver is still the heir of the promise. And here is the matter of embarrassment. Why would the Israelites include Jacob as a deceiver in their origin story? And we'll get to that in a little bit. Okay. So scholars typically understand the purpose of the story is twofold. Number one, to show that God had chosen Jacob and not Esau. And secondly, also to say how the place Bethel got its name. Bethel was formerly known, of course, as Luz. Okay, so Jacob. Now, Jacob is not an easy-go-lucky guy. His life is full of struggle, right? He struggles with his brother. He deceives his dad. He runs from them. He goes to Laban. There he gets deceived. He has to work 7 years for Rachel. He gets Leah. He works another 7 years for Rachel. He then feels like he wants to run away. He does. We'll talk about that. Laban doesn't want to let him go because as far as Laban is concerned, God is actually blessing him, Laban, because of Jacob. So there's this interpretation that this boy, this man, this deceiver is so chosen by God that even if you just share space with him, you become blessed as well. Now, that's a prefiguring of the promise of Abraham, a blessing to the world, blessing to the nations. But the question is, how will a deceiver bless the nations? So that's a little bit tricky. Let me just tap this. It feels like it's going really dark. Or was it just me? All right. Anyway. Okay. So Leah, of course, is fertile. Rachel can't have children. Nevertheless, Leah has a bunch of children. He also has children from slave girls. And then last and finally, Rachel has for him Joseph and Benjamin, the two beloved ones, right? Who would be chosen again above all the other older brothers. In the end, we sit with 12 sons of Jacob, by Leah, by Rachel. He also has a daughter called Dinah, but we don't really hear much about it. People didn't write about daughters, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So Jacob wants to leave. Laban doesn't want him to go. So Jacob strikes a deal, and by magic, Jacob gets his flock to multiply more than other people. He doesn't pray over them. He doesn't. He puts it. It's literally like it's magic. He puts sticks there, and they go stripy, and then he takes the sticks away, and they go non-stripy, and he just becomes richer and richer and richer, and eventually he runs away. And this is another matter of embarrassment for the Israelites. Here we go. Laban chases after Jacob. Why? Not because he wants the blessing or his daughters are there, because someone took his household idols. Hello? What is going on here? Are these people idol worshippers? But the best part of the story is who took them. Rachel, this beloved mother of Joseph and Benjamin, the one that Jacob loves with, his first love. She's the one who steals the idols. Why is she stealing idols? Because she wants to use them. Jacob has idols in his house. And this is slightly sobering, but I think we need to understand that Jacob is by no means a monotheist. That's not what's going on in the story. These people are still very much part of a polytheistic type of society. They have not cleared out all other gods. That's not what's going on here. They're very much in the dark with regards to a pure monotheism. And the beloved Rachel hides all of these household idols, I can't remember exactly, but kind of like on her camel or horse or whatever, and she sits on it. Laban gets there, he says, somebody took my idols. Jacob doesn't know anything about it. He says, whoever has those will die. He doesn't know. The idol thief, the chief idolater is his beloved wife. Rachel uses her menstruation as an excuse not to get off her travel animal, and she gets away with it. Right, another form of deception and of theft. You know what I mean? And so let's get back to the point of embarrassment. Why would Israel write stories of their past in terms of idol worship, deceiving? Jacob it's not going well for the side. So a lot of people argue and say, well, why would they write an embarrassing past if it wasn't 100% true? But the other side of this is also important, that we need to realize who are these writers writing to. They're writing to a people who have failed. They're writing to people who were kicked out of their land because of their idolatry and their struggle with their relationship with God. And if Jacob can make it and be changed, then so can we. God will be faithful to us, even if we are idolatrous, which we are and which we've been. The reality was that in Israel, and our archaeology can actually show this, that the pre-exilic Israel, in Jerusalem at least, had household idols. What was the name? Oh my goodness, I'm going to go down the wrong, because I didn't really prepare to say and mention this, but we know from archaeology that at pre-exiled Jerusalem, Israel people that lived there, they had household idols, and not a few. I think the last calc I heard was 2 or 3 per household. There was enough found by today's archaeologists in Jerusalem for it to have been enough to be 2 to 3 per household. It wasn't something that some people did. All of them were busy with this. The point is that this gives us a perspective on why they would have written of Jacob in such a negative light, because they were trying to say that if God can be faithful to Jacob, God can be faithful to us. Nevertheless, Jacob gets away. Now he's on his way back to Esau, and he wants to go make peace with Esau, and he travels back to Esau. Now Esau wants his life, so it's not going to be an easy story, but this is the road back to a form of reconciliation. All right, let me just get to my notes here so I make sure. So during that night, before he meets Esau, he meets with this otherworldly being, angel. The story is told as if it was actually God that comes down and fights with Jacob. And Jacob says, I'm not going to leave you until you bless me. Like Jacob is beating God in the MMA match, right? Because to see won the world championship again, like this, that type of thing. But in this story, Jacob's beating God at the MMA fight, and God says to Jacob, hey, leave me, I want to go. Like it's ridiculous. Anyway, but it's a story. It's a theological story. And Jacob says, I won't leave you until you bless me. And what happens in that moment is God renames Jacob. He said, you'll no longer be Jacob, the deceiver, but you'll be Israel, the one who rules or struggles with God. And so in this night of despair, right before he's basically facing a possible killing by his brother, his name is changed, and in that it's implied that his nature is changed. He becomes his identity changes. Isaiah wrote of this in this way. I can't remember exactly where in Isaiah, but it says Jacob was born, but Israel was formed. 2 different Hebrew words used there. And it gives us an idea that the deceiver becomes a companion of God, a struggler with God, someone who turns himself towards God. This happens in the night before he goes and faces Esau. And of course, that place he called Peniel, which means the face of God. So he goes to his brother. The next day, he sends a lot of gifts ahead of him. And comes in humility before Esau. They reconcile. He bows 7 times before him. And the brothers are reconciled. And now you have an identity called Israel for the first time. You have the protagonist of the whole story is now there. He used to be a deceiver. He used to struggle. He used to be involved in deceit and lying and theft and idolatry. But now he's a new person and he's ready now to become the father of this amazing nation. And that seems to be a mirror of where the Israelites find themselves when the elites are writing these stories. They are Israel. They were chosen by God. They are the heirs to this amazing promise, but they've been involved in theft and idolatry, and they've been kicked out of their land. They are now under a Babylonian oppression, pressure, Babylonian culture, religious culture, social culture, and they now have to make a decision. What are we going to do? And the story seemed to remind them that they need to be Israel. They need to be those who continue to struggle with God and their relationship with God, because even if they are faithless, God will be faithful to them. And so this is the journey of Isaac into Jacob. I'm not going to go any further on this today. I think that's fine for now. But here we have now the main character of the entire series of the Torah, and Genesis being that episode, or that that season in which from nothing there comes Israel, the protagonist, and the 12 tribes are born. They are there. And so we leave it at that.
Yeah.
So just very important to realize that these stories are written later, and to see then how they reflect the
That's the main takeaway
contemporary
for me.
reality of Israel, are locked up in these ancient stories. Now, these ancient stories might have a kernel of historicity to them, but there's no doubt that they were later shaped to fit contemporary problems, to offer contemporary solutions.
To explain things, to justify things.
Absolutely, absolutely. So as a Christian, as someone who believes in God and in Jesus and values the scripture, it's important that we have this balance when we go back to Genesis. And this is one of the reasons why we will not necessarily hold to the Mosaic law, because we understand the conditions under which these things come into being. So we're not going to be running around telling people they shouldn't eat pork and they shouldn't cut their beards and they shouldn't wear cotton and linen together, because we understand where these things come from. That's all for today. Thank you so much for being with us. Have a wonderful week.
See you next time.
Cheers.
Bye.